Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week starts off a brand new month, which means it's time for the next issue of Spawn. Spawn number 15 to be specific, so let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in November of 1993, and can we just take a moment to appreciate what I consider to be the most iconic and also greatest cover of Spawn Year 2. This is fantastic, man. We get the cool close-up of medieval Spawn with the Violator's head just impaled on his sword. You've got like the necro energy trailing off. Really great coloration through that by Ollie Optics. I really love how detailed they got with the reflections in the armor, and then also just the way that the necro energy and whatnot is trailing off and changing color as it goes. It's super cool. The only real complaint I have about this cover is that it may as well just say, spoiler alert, medieval Spawn totally decapitates Violator in this issue. Story and art, Todd McFarlane. Letters and editor, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Steve Oliff, Ruben Rude, and Ollie Optics. We see here on the first page, there is a boatload of exposition starting us off. The short version is, this is basically just giving a recap of what brought the Violator to this point, why he no longer has the ability to turn into his demon form and use his powers. Basically, it's a punishment from the Mavolja because he was supposed to go to Earth and basically do the same thing that he did with the medieval Spawn with Al Simmons. And that was to draw him out, test his powers, mess with him, just kind of see what he could do, and if he was really up to snuff in becoming a general in the Mavolja's army. However, when he did this with the medieval Spawn, he did it by killing a bunch of innocents to draw him out, and this is kind of where he messed up in the 90s with Al Simmons, is that he, instead of going after innocents, went after mafiosos and criminals and the kind of people that Mavolja likes having out in the world because they're doing evil. And because Violator started killing off all of them, the mafia kind of slowed things down and more kind of kept to themselves, really trying to keep a low profile until they figured out who was killing them, which caused overall crime in New York City to go down, which made Mavolja really angry. And also, there was nothing that would really have drawn out Spawn or Al Simmons by killing all these mafiosos. Like, he had no connection to the mob, so there wasn't really any reason for him to care about those guys getting murdered and being, slaughtered in large quantities. So it was a really just kind of ridiculous plan from the get-go. And this part of the book really kind of tries to illustrate that Violator's not all that smart. It's not that he's a moron or anything. He's just not as bright as you would hope if he's someone who ranks high among your, demon soldiers that you're planning on using to storm the gates of heaven, as Mavolja is. We see that the story picks back up exactly where it left off, where he is still regaling the three young boys that he was, telling the story to before. And this is his new plan, by the way. It's to try and basically slow burn, get these kids to, start down the wrong path and become evil men when they grow up. Although I don't understand how that would happen, as Violator is painting himself as a heroic figure throughout all of this story and basically lying and saying that he was doing good. So despite the fact that he is, the villain and was doing wrong, that's not the way he's portraying it. So I don't, again, know how this plan was supposed to pan out in the long run. We see that the three boys are becoming less enthralled by Violator's story, just at this point really just believing he's completely full of it, as one of them even states, "So you're some fire breather who's also an 800-year-old fighting stud?" To which he replies, "Exactly." And to be fair, this is one of the few things that Violator is actually being truthful about in this story, but he continues on stating that he believed that he had defeated the medieval spawn as he couldn't find any traces of his body, but he still needed a trophy to bring home to Mabolja to prove that he had defeated him and that he was actually a more suitable choice as a general in Hell's armies, as a native-born, demon, and decided that he would do so by bringing home the head of the girl that medieval spawn was in love with, who he's, portraying as an evil witch mother to the three youths. And this is because Mabolja would know that there's no way that this woman would be, dead if medieval spawn had the ability to stop it. She, of course, is terrified, begging him not to do any harm to her. He, of course, then, rebukes her, saying that the god she prays to is in fact his enemy. So she can pray all she wants. Nothing's going to save her now, as he decides that he wants to do this slowly, as he just kind of starts to cut her a little bit with one of his nails, holding it up in front of her, showing her the blood. And then suddenly, from out of nowhere, his finger is lopped off because he does not have the upper hand that he believed he did. We then see that Violator's finger was hacked off by none other than the medieval spawn, who was able to teleport out of his armor before being hit by Violator's fire blast. Unfortunately, he is now exposed as his true self in front of the woman who he was in love with, and she's not quite prepared for what she's seeing. She was not aware of the fact that medieval spawn was dead and resurrected as some sort of mystical, magical hell soldier. We also see that he's still carrying the ridiculous, just nonsensical broadsword that apparently can shapeshift, because Todd doesn't draw it the same way in any two panels throughout this entire book. He's understandably very angry at the Violator and really starts to just unload his scorn about how Violator is a coward and he expected better from someone who was supposedly trying to be a higher ranking officer in Hell's armies, and really kind of holding on to a lot of his past as who he believed he was in the world of the living, the same way that Al Simmons does, and really exuding a lot of chivalry, holding himself to, somewhat of a stringent code, which only makes you wonder what exactly it was that he did to land himself in hell in the first place. Violator then, of course, is furious that Spawn, or the medieval Spawn, I should say, is still alive, screaming out that they both work for the same person, and that, medieval Spawn talking down to him is of no consequence, as he'll too have to bow to the will of the Mabolja. He reaches back, smashing a tree in half. The young maiden, who is now seeing medieval Spawn for the first time as his true self, is understandably quite horrified by what she sees as she screams out what has happened to her, what has happened to her prince, which I don't know if this is to infer that medieval Spawn actually was royalty in the world of the living before he died. This is never explained in this book, and I don't know if it's ever touched upon going forward, at least not soon. We then see that Violator grabs a tree from the trunk, rips it out by its roots, and then takes a swing at medieval Spawn. He, of course, dodges out of the way and then leaps forward, trying to slice into the Violator and press his own attack. Violator, meanwhile, is portraying himself in the role of medieval Spawn throughout this entire story. Like I said, constantly claiming himself to be the hero and the one who is, fighting for a righteous cause, despite the fact that he openly admitted to the three youths that he was in fact an agent of hell, which would seem contradictory. But again, like I stated, it is portrayed that Violator is not really as bright as you might hope. As the battle rages on, the maiden, who, by the way, we never actually learn this woman's name. She's just referred to as a maiden or as medieval Spawn's beloved, but her name is never actually spoken throughout issues number 14 or 15. She watches on in horror as she now does or believes that Medieval Spawn has been transformed into something unrecognizable as he continues to attack Violator, and Violator continues to counterattack. She even states, "My prince, what have you become?" Medieval Spawn then lunges forward with his broadsword. However, he is overextending himself as Violator grabs his arm, knocks the sword out of his hand, and Medieval Spawn is forced to fall back instead of being killed by the strike of Violator. Violator's strength is really put on display in this issue. Before now, we had never really fully understood exactly the kind of physical prowess that he has, but seeing him rip full-size trees out of the ground and swinging them around like a baseball bat really kind of shows he's might look real spindly and skinny, but he's got some, next level super strength on his side. However, Medieval Spawn wastes no time in going back on the offensive as he leaps through the air onto the top of Violator, striking him into the forehead with his fist. Violator, however, grabs a hold of him and throws him back down in front of him, believing he now has the upper hand. Unfortunately, not paying attention to his surroundings as he is currently standing atop of all of Medieval Spawn's gear, his armor, shield, chains, cape, and whatnot. He then unleashes a blast of fire again from his mouth, point blank, believing that he now has the upper hand, as Medieval Spawn has no room to try and dodge this attack. We then see Medieval Spawn being struck by the fire attack as it launches him through the air, him flying backwards, seemingly defeated. And Violator starts to revel in his victory until he is cut off when he realizes he is being subdued by the entirety of all of Medieval Spawn's gear, as his chains, cape, and symbiote are all able to exist and act on their own accord without his direct involvement, much like that of Al Simmons. They completely start to engulf him, wrapping him up so that he can't move. The maiden is quite surprised to see this. And then Medieval Spawn begins to make his approach from the rear, stating that he brought up a mystical shield to protect him from the blast, which did cost him a lot of his powers, and also is using his powers to transmute a new sword for himself. This one, he states, is a mystical sword. I don't know if the previous one was supposed to be, or perhaps it is just his way of continuously reproducing this sword. I don't know. It's never fully explained. He then continues to basically, talk down to the Violator, exclaiming that he'll never bow down to the will of the Mabalja and he'll never be his servant, as he states that it's time for him to end this battle as he lunges forward and decapitates the Violator, as we see the Violator's head flying through the air. We see the Violator's head bounce then across the ground as it falls in a heap of flesh and necroplasm. The young maiden then begs Medieval Spawn not to harm her. He states that, she can be calm and that he apologizes for not ever showing her his true form, but he wanted to make sure that she loved him for who he was. Unfortunately, she has reached her emotional and psychological breaking point as she is now terrified of him and runs away when she is unbound from the tree, screaming for help, yelling at him to stay away. He begs her to please not do this to him. But it's hard to blame her, given that she is, just found out that the man that she was in love with is in actuality a resurrected, burnt zombie corpse and has just witnessed him do battle with a literal hell demon. It's understandable that, this would be far too overwhelming for her to really comprehend or accept. We then see that Medieval Spawn begins to tear up as he realizes that the love that he thought he had finally found is once again just pulled from him and completely out of his grasp. And it's kind of a real, sad low point for his existence, as it's really taking away the one thing that he was still holding on to in terms of hope for a new beginning in the life that he came back to. Violator then states that, this battle was all 100% true, and that it has become that he was, in fact, the first account of a dragon in medieval Europe, as we see an illustration of him in old parchment where he's drawn to look like a dragon. This all comes from the stories that this woman was telling as she would run from town to town, just kind of retelling her story in more, wild fashion as her psyche broke more and more throughout the years. Meanwhile, he then explains that when he was transported back to hell after being killed, that Mabolja was quite pleased with everything that he accomplished and remade him again in his previous body, and stated that he is proud of the work that he did. Now, with the story finished, we are teleported back to the alleyway as we see Violator throwing out his arms, finishing up the story in grandiose fashion, portraying himself as the victor and the hero, basically just flat out lying to the boys about what really happened. However, they've all completely lost interest in the story at this point, as we see them running back out of the alleyway, calling Clown, aka the Violator, a loser and a bozo. He, of course, is infuriated by this and claims that he's going to make them pay for their disrespect, when he's interrupted by a stray newspaper flying through the air that smacks him directly in the face. As he pulls the newspaper off his face and begins to read it, he's made even more angry by the fact that he starts to read an article about all of the mafia murders that he was committing, and realizes that they're not even mentioning him at all in any of these news stories, because they believe that the murders were committed by a new cloaked vigilante Youngblood type in their midst. Of course, they're describing what they know as the reports of Spawn, or potentially some Shadowhawk type who is just out of control. This makes Violator completely furious, as he realizes that he's not even gotten the credit for the murders that he committed, which landed him in the situation he's in currently. So he decides that he's going to go straight down to Tony Twist's office and headquarters and just confess to all the murders flat out, so that he can get the recognition he feels he deserves, which is exactly where the Violator miniseries picks up. And if you'd like to know more about the Violator miniseries, you can check out my video here on YouTube about Violator miniseries number 1. And I am going to be continuing that series to finish off all of that miniseries within the next few months. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, we see Spawn, aka Al Simmons, passed out in some garbage, as he states that he doesn't really need a whole lot of sleep anymore, this probably having to do with his resurrection and newly found hell powers, but it is some way for him to get a little bit of reprieve and, time to try and get away from all the madness that has become his life. However, he is very violently awoken by I guess, security or bouncer who works at this restaurant, yelling at him that, he's told all these homeless bums to stay away from the garbage behind the back door, and that they don't have any business being here. Al, not wanting to start any trouble, states that it's fine, he'll get up, he's on his way, and states that he's never heard of someone being, so obsessed with protecting garbage before. The man, however, seems to be very irritated by the smart comments that Al has made, and decides to teach him a lesson as he begins to start beating him senseless, throwing elbows, punching him in the face, knocking him down onto the ground. However, Al's inner monologue starts to tell us a story of how he learned in the military that direct force was not always the best way to deal with things, kind of showing how he's learned that, he can't just be using his powers for everything that he gets himself into, as he needs to conserve these until he can find a way to somehow rid himself of the burden of being a slave to Hell and the Mabalja, and figure out a way he can prevent himself from suffering through a quote unquote second death, as the Mabalja puts it. He does realize, however, though, that this man is not going to stop until he makes him stop. He looks at the man stating he said he would leave, but the man states that he's going to leave in a body bag. This, of course, pushes Al over the edge, and he strikes back. However, he doesn't need to use any of his powers, as all of the fighting skills he learned in the U.S. Special Forces are more than a match to take down this one guy who's working a security job at a restaurant. And then we see that Al has reached a point of being very angry and states that he wants to show this guy something real special. Al turns behind him and rips 2 pieces of board off of a fence in the alleyway. We see then a thunk thunk as he stabs the pieces of board on either side of the man's head, stating that those boards could have been easily just slammed through his eye sockets so that his brain would be leaking out of the holes. He then tells the man that, he's, giving him an opportunity to go about his life and continue to breathe, and tells the man that he wants him to leave the alleyway pronto instead of being the one who has to leave himself. The man realizes that he really just had a brush with death and is lucky to be escaping with his life, as we see him just take off back down the alleyway in silhouette form. Again, this issue, just like the last issue, you may have noticed a lot of non-backgrounds being drawn, a lot of artistic shortcuts being taken so that Todd could get this book out on time, as we see he's becoming more and more pressed and having a harder and harder time getting books illustrated and out for coloration in time to meet the deadlines for the monthly release dates of each book, which is why this is actually the last book that Todd will be the primary artist penciling for on Spawn, as Greg Capullo will be taking over in issue number 16. We then see Spawn, still holding one of the planks of wood. All of his clothes are gone now. There's no real explanation as to why that happened. He's just, out in his burnt naked form now. He then states that, he wants to send a message loud and clear that this alley and all of Hell's Kitchen is now Spawn territory. And this is the moment where we see that, Al's starting to reach a point where he's tired of running, he's tired of hiding, and he wants to be given the reverence and respect he feels he deserves, and that he's going to start taking a stand in making Hell's Kitchen and the alleyways of Hell's Kitchen his own home. But at the same time, he did show real restraint in not just flat out murdering the guy that was assaulting him, even though he very easily could have done so. On the final page of the story, we are teleported back to the residence of Terry and Wanda Fitzgerald, where Terry is once again receiving a very ominous phone call from a member of the government who was working underneath Jason Wynn, basically threatening him and his wife and his child, letting him know that they are constantly watching him and their every move, and that there's nowhere he'd ever be able to run, even if he wanted to. This, of course, is all in reference to the fact that they believe that Terry is the one who has been searching through files and was the one who stole some files, when in actuality that was Spawn who had done all those things. But of course, the government has no idea that Al Simmons, aka Spawn, is once again alive. So for them, Terry's the only logical choice of the person who would have been doing these things. As the story ends with Terry in a panicked state, not realizing, why he's being targeted or what he can do to protect his own family. As we see in the next issue, Grant Morrison will be writing and Greg Capullo will be taking over on penciling duties. On the next page, we get, once again, a page of Image Info, which is just a breakdown of upcoming comics that are going to be published by Image Nothing really special or unique, just kind of more of the same. We are then treated to two full-page splash mini posters, I guess is what you would call them. I really like both of these. Unfortunately, I can't make out exactly who they were done by, as I don't recognize these signatures and they're not totally legible. But this one here, we get Spawn blasting out through a large glass window in the side of a skyscraper. And this one, we have him facing off against the Violator. And I really like the way that this one is done. The monochromatic purple is, I think, really unique, as almost everyone else always tries to focus on the green and the necroplasm. I like that someone else was willing to, take an opportunity to kind of like put their own spin on it. I also really like how Violator's got super huge fangs in this one, just really menacing looking. This is a cool image. I like this a lot. We then once again come to the spawning grounds. There's actually some really neat letters in this one. One of which a reader has written in talking about how he was very impressed by something he saw Todd do at a Comic-Con, in which there was a boy who was sitting with Todd the whole day, just kind of helping him out as he was doing a book signing, and that it was because the boy had been kind of accosted by some other people at the convention, and Todd really didn't like the fact that he was kind of being pushed around and bullied, so he just let him sit with him to just kind of give him a day with, a rather famous comic book artist, but also give him the opportunity to just kind of have a safe spot to be for the rest of the convention, and, get to really enjoy himself for a while, which is a really cool thing that Todd would do. And it was also really cool of this person to actually like write a letter about it and point it out. Otherwise, I probably, as a story that would have just never gone any further and no one would have ever really known about. There's also a really long letter about a guy, or where a guy is writing in about a lot of things about, his own personal beliefs in Christianity and whatnot, and, kind of wondering where Todd is pulling ideas from in terms of the way that the story is going and that kind of thing. And I should point out, the guy is actually really respectful in the way he writes this letter. It's never at a point of him being condescending. There's never any point where he's being really judgmental about Todd or the way that he's portraying the story. Even though, Todd, while he does use the most basic premises of Christianity for the backdrop and foundation of the Spawn story, that's kind of where it ends. From that point on, he's just kind of, making it up as he goes along, using his own type of world building to create the mythology, and not really hardline trying to follow any sort of like biblical tenets or whatnot. It's just kind of, like I said, the basic story of, God versus Satan type of thing to get everything going. But from that point on, it's all Todd and just his own unique spin on the whole thing, which Todd actually points out that he's not someone who believes in God. And, he was happy to hear that even though this guy had a different belief system than him, that he wasn't, put off or offended by the things that Todd was doing with his story, and really kind of thanked the guy for his letter. And, just was very appreciative of the fact that this guy would be such a supporter of his, even though, his own beliefs were so different. Back in 1993, the world was a different place in terms of the sharing of ideas and, the way that people viewed their own religious beliefs and that kind of thing. It wasn't as, I don't want to say laissez-faire, but people were usually more hardline in the way they thought of stuff and took things more literal, and kind of, almost used their religious beliefs as an extension of what their own personality or what their own self-value was in a lot of circumstances. And it was kind of refreshing to see someone who, while they didn't necessarily agree with what Todd was writing, took the time to, really say, hey, we're on a different page, but I still appreciate what you do. and I do like your work. It was just a nice little like mutual respect type of thing. And then there's also the last letter that someone wrote in, which was a guy who basically stated that he used Spawn as a means to kind of reconnect with his kids, as he and his wife had divorced, and he went basically 6 months really without ever seeing his kids, and when they finally had a chance to reconnect, it was really awkward, and he took the boys out, and one of them just happened to see Spawn on the shelf and decided to pick it up. And the father then started talking to his sons about how he used comics as a kid to kind of teach himself how to draw, and then he started drawing pictures for his kids that they could color in, and it was kind of turned into a whole new bonding experience for them, and that every time he would write them letters or spend time with them, that he would always have new drawings for them. It was really a cool story to hear, and it was really nice to see that he was able to take something as simple as a comic book and use it as a tool to just have a new experience in reconnecting with his sons. We then see 2 pages of Image fan art, a lot of different Image characters, obviously some Spawn pics. We've got some Wildcats, some Cyberforce, Super Patriot, obviously he's the most important. And I do like the fact that somebody went to the trouble of putting in an image of Trencher. I think I might have like Trencher #1 and maybe Trencher #2. I'll have to dig through my collection. If I find it, I'll at least do a video on #1. I don't know how many issues there even are of Trencher. I'd have to do a little research, but I know it wasn't a comic book that ran for like a super long period of time. We then see a blurb about the Wizard Fan Awards, showing all of the different nominations that the Spawn team got through the Image Fan Awards, which is kind of cool. We then see an advertisement for Prophet. I have quite a few issues of Prophet, and I will eventually get to it. I just want to get to the point where Prophet, I think, makes his first appearance in an issue of Youngblood. I could be wrong about that, and if I am, I apologize, but I'm almost positive that's where he first starts out, and I want to get to that point in Youngblood before I start getting into Prophet. On the final page of the book, we see an advertisement for the Spawn Batman team-up comic from 1994. I do have this, and I will try and figure out how exactly I'm gonna do a video on it, because if I remember, it's got kind of a hard spine to it, which is a little bit tricky with my setup, but I'll figure something out. And on the reverse inside cover, we see an advertisement for Spawn Sprogs, which are just Pogs. But Todd McFarlane, much like Jim Lee, was not going to pay the licensing fee to use the actual Pogs name, which kind of illustrates one of the great failings of Pogs for the very short amount of time that they were super popular, is that literally anybody can print pictures on silver dollar-sized pieces of cardboard and then sell them to kids, and none of them have to license your name to do it. So there were all kinds of these quote-unquote Pogs being printed up and sold, and none of the money was going back to, the actual Pog company, which was not really helping them in any ways. And the fact that you're also talking about a drink that by and large, especially at the time, only really exists or existed in Hawaii, their ability to try and challenge any of this stuff was going to be really difficult and really expensive, and in the long run, probably not worth the effort, which is why all of this stuff kind of kept getting printed up, and, they didn't do anything about it. And that was Spawn number 15. Overall, I thought it was a great book. Like I said, the cover's fantastic. It does a really good job of giving us more insight and more backstory about the medieval Spawn. He's the first Spawn variant we're ever really told about in the entirety of the narrative. And, he's an interesting character. He, I believe, probably pops up more frequently than any of the other Spawns of the past. And he's in it. I like him. I've always liked medieval Spawn. I've always thought he was really cool in all of the different, iterations and miniseries and stories that he's shown up in. This, of course, would lead to other different Spawns of the Past getting series. There was Spawn the Dark Ages. You also get Gunslinger Spawn. There's supposed to be just tons of Spawns throughout the ages. Of course, there's many who never get their own story. But, I like that this book, kind of took a time out with 2 issues to just kind of go into a little bit more of a character who got really popular and I think may have only been supposed to be like a one-off at one point, but just kind of was so popular they kept him around. But it also does a good job of kind of like introducing us into how the Violator miniseries starts. Wraps it all up with the idea that Al Simmons has reached his breaking point, that he's tired of being pushed around. He's going to become, essentially the lord of the alleyways. And also reminding us of all of the problems that Terry Fitzgerald is facing in his life with the fallout of Al Simmons's actions that have, kind of put a lot of pressure on him from Jason Wynn. I also really liked the letter section in this book. Like I said, I know I, dwelled on it for quite a while in this episode, but there were really good letters, and I really appreciated the time and the way in which Todd responded to all of them. It wasn't just the standard of like, oh, you're the greatest comic book artist. Oh, thanks. Cool. It was really like deeper letters with deeper responses. But those are just my opinions. Maybe you read this book and didn't like any of it, but that's okay because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.